Hi everyone, today I'm talking to Natalie Hendry, a PhD student from RMIT and a lecturer in the School of Education at Deakin. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, our topic that I'm talking to you about primarily is called Sexing Up Digital Media, from online dating to sexting to porn, basically bringing in this broad kind of topic. So your background is certainly intersecting with a lot of these kinds of areas. I wonder if you can tell us a bit about your background, how you came to be here today.
Okay. So part of my research with my PhD is looking at young people's uses of social media, and even if I'm not looking directly at sex or sexuality or relationships or gender or something else that fits under there, it's going to come through in your work no matter what. So I'm looking at young people's experiences of mental illness and how they use social media in everyday ways. So that's, I guess, one part of my life. If I put a different hat on, I've worked in sexual health research for about 3 or 4 years. Prior to that, I worked in sex ed and did a lot of work about what it means to use media in relationships. So working with, say, Year 9 students to say, what are your boundaries and limits with relationships? Should someone contact you all the time? How do you make time for somebody else? And those are the kinds of questions you can ask, whether you're talking about how much time you're spending on Facebook or face-to-face or going to the movies or whatever else. I guess I've always been obsessed with the internet. I technically grew up on the internet, so more than half of my life, I think it's been 18 years of me having an email address, being on message boards, and I spoke to you earlier about running chat sites and things like that, about music in particular, and I guess some of the personal things. And if I'm going to be visible about where I come from with this, the first person I kissed romantically I met online when I was in high school, and that was more than 10 years ago. So in some ways the kinds of problems we have now and the questions people are asking are things that have been part of my life for a long time.
Yeah, you're much more experienced online than I am. I'm thinking my first email was first to uni. It's probably why nothing romantically happened for me until the point I got on the internet.
It's probably a good thing too, because it's interesting, even someone that I'd met in 1997 and the friends that I had on that space who were living in Melbourne, we used to go and see some of the same bands together, still pop up in different ways, in different spaces on social media, whether it be Facebook and the way that people from our past can kind of just filter into our who to add the box at the side, or popping up in Twitter in really interesting ways, or the sorts of things that people might find really confronting is having someone who's been an ex or someone that has been not so kind to them, or even been part of a violent relationship, popping up in different photos and spaces too. So some of that context collapse definitely happens. But it just sort of feels like something that's part of our lives now, definitely.
Yeah, a lot of what we talk about is the strategic negotiation of your own online identity or identities, and even that ethical dilemma, which is kind of an old school ethical dilemma of what you do at the end of a relationship when, that ends. How quickly do you end it on Facebook? What message is that sending?
Do you de-tag someone? It's always interesting when someone's Instagram account goes from 300 photos down to 100 photos. Okay, so maybe 3,000 to 1,000. Because they've started to delete things that had really, really significant emotional feelings attached to those images, because there was something they did with a partner, or something with a family member, or something with their kids, and maybe their kids are now saying we don't want to be online, or they've broken up with a partner, or someone's died in their family too. So in some ways the images that we use or the content that we put online has such an emotional quality. But in perhaps, and this is what you said about strategic negotiation, we can delete things and we can change them, and we can curate things, and we can make things private, as opposed to just putting that photo album under the bed or burning things, as some people may have done in the past. I never have. You don't need to burn my emails.
Yeah, no, exactly right. It's an interesting time to talk about all these kinds of issues, because when it comes to the contemporary controversies that are happening at the moment, the Kim Kardashian nude selfie, even last year, or I think it was last year, the year before, the Victorian laws changing around sexting, that kind of thing. It's all very up to the minute, a sexy topic, I suppose, if I can, pardon the pun, but
let's go with that.
And I mean, the online dating sites that proliferate, and there's just more and more coming out. The commercial side of that, how people are negotiating their identities on those things. It's a really good area to be working in, with gender being at the forefront of political discourse.
And sexuality and race and ability and things like that. And particularly thinking about, say, hookup apps and dating sites, it's always interesting when somebody uses somebody's phone and they've been in a relationship for a long time. They're very curious about Tinder or Grindr or Happen or Scruff or any of the other different apps. And they're going through for their friends, and it becomes sort of a social, it's almost like a social experiment, seeing how people who are not on those apps respond to them, because they're often horrified and they feel it's a marketplace, and you're flicking through and you're making these judgments about people. And if you look at the history of relationships and the history of sexuality, relationships were based on class. They were very much based on gender. So you know, to be in a relationship with someone who is the same sex as you wouldn't make sense, or it would be something you would hide. We've always used letters and images as a way of courting people, whether that be someone rides their horse over to your house. Here is my calling card. They give that to, I was going to say the maid, the butler.
Yep.
Then you go back on your horse, and then you get another card, and then you get chaperoned and you go on this date, and if everyone's okay, then you get married and make babies and whatever else happens. But we've got sort of those ways of using text to help people start relationships. We've always used postcards. We've always used letters. If you want to look at the history of using words, or even images and people painting things for other people, that's part of, you know, our relationship history. So it's interesting when now we can use text in talking to people on apps. We've used images. We can now also use geolocation. So in the same way, you're not going to ride your horse across from Spain to Italy. You might just be able to go, okay, I can go from this suburb to the next one, and see where people are too. We make a lot of judgments about where people live and what they look like and how they're using words that often give us clues about their personality, but also about their backgrounds too. And I don't think that's new. We've just got different ways of doing it now that bring up all those challenges that you said about negotiating those things.
Yeah, and the age of the image hasn't necessarily sort of got rid of the ability to use words well, as it kind of becomes even more important.
Absolutely.
I mean, with online dating sites, you've got, and I actually did an introductory exercise in my first seminar. I replicated, without students knowing, the eHarmony matching process, from quick questions to makes or breaks to the dig deeper. And everyone kind of talked to a stranger in that way, and then I revealed, this is what we just did.
Yeah.
Isn't it weird that you relied on the template answers the vast majority of times, instead of make your own answer, which was also, an absolute option for people. So it is interesting the way in which it kind of, the issue of how much freedom, is it empowering, is it actually limiting our identities insofar as most people, because they're time poor, they're attention poor perhaps, do pick the template answers in online dating sites, that you've got a lot of issues arising about how actually beneficial it is to be a little bit different and go against the convention.
And there's sorts of spaces that don't have templates, say like Tinder, for example, and anyone can write anything. There are so many PDF booklets about how to use Tinder, how to game Tinder, what to say. People have done lots of research about, what sort of opening lines get people interested, and the kinds of photos you should have up that kind of act as a text that we can read. Oh, this person's got a Red Bull hat on. What does that mean about the stuff that they're into? Oh, maybe they're into extreme sports and motocross. Okay, I'm not really into that. Swipe left. One of the brilliant things though about having that flexibility in language as well as the images is that we can screenshot things. We can go and say to our friends, oh, I like this, what this person said, but I'm not sure about it. How do I respond to it? It's almost like having the Greek chorus to just check in and go, how do I feel about this? And there's so many different Tumblr accounts and Instagram accounts where people have taken things that they're not so happy about. So some of the sexism or homophobia that comes up, and racism on these sites or apps or whatever you want to call them, and responded to them, and people have a discussion down the bottom. Oh, was that flirting, or was it sexism, or was it an attack? We have these brilliant opportunities to have these conversations about what is a relationship, what are people after, how do we talk about things like negotiating sex if it isn't in a long-term married relationship. How do we do that? And the stuff that's popping up on Tumblr about that is fascinating. For the work that I've done, and as someone who was a secondary school teacher, it's really useful for young people to step back and be able to go, oh, I'm not sure how I feel about that, and check in with their friends. Of course, there'll be chances where they'll take screenshots of images or text and show their friends in ways that aren't appropriate, whether that be sort of a naked selfie that someone sent to them. that they've consented for that person to see, but not everybody else. But for young people to have conversations about what they want in relationships, and that's kind of what that eHarmony structure does. This is what you want, this is who I am, really clarifying those values. It's really useful.
Yeah, I think the taboo around online dating is kind of almost, it's dissipating slowly or
Definitely.
probably increasingly quickly as time goes on, because in the end, it is an incredibly efficient and effective way of meeting, in inverted commas, a lot more people than you would be able to by catching up for coffee, unless you can kind of start to sort people before that. I'm really glad that you segued very smoothly into sexting there, because all these things are related. It's not like we can categorise these kinds of issues. And what's really interesting around the sexting issue is, and you look at this, and as a teacher you would have potentially seen this in the past, the kind of government-funded, driven films, educational films around, and I share these to students. They're very much they're shaming of the victim shaming usually. They're very highly gendered. The dominant social discourses that are perpetuated in the mainstream news media in particular, that I see all of the time, that young people are innocent, vulnerable, need protecting, when they're actually probably more strategic, as you're saying, and able to network and get advice and really work these things out for themselves. That is a very kind of damaging discourse, and so many people, when we hear these bad stories, and that's the easiest stories to come get into your head, isn't it?
So easy, particularly because they're the ones that make us go, oh, I can't believe that person did that, and you kind of get sucked into it. It's almost like the clickbait stories of media, and I'm not going to name names of newspapers, but that's perhaps the way they're running. It's interesting because if we look at the history of youth and when young people became a group, we can go back to looking at criminalisation and young people who were delinquents. They were ones committing crime and things like that. And when we talk about crime, we need to be protected from young people, or we need to protect young people. So all through youth studies, there's this kind of needs protection, need to be protected from kind of tension floating through whether or not we're talking about young people being into gothic music or emos or something like that, and they're self-harming, all those kinds of discourses. And often we call them moral or media panics, because we need to protect those young people, but we also need to protect us from, or the poor vulnerable children from being infected by these other people. And that's been mapped onto things like sexting, young people's experiences of pornography, online relationships, and talking about sex. So in terms of sexting, what's interesting with some of the Australian research is that young people are a bit indifferent to it. First of all, what is sexting? They sort of say, well, sexting's an adult word. It's not a word that we use. What are you talking about? Are you talking about naked photos? And naked photos in what context? Do you mean me showing my friend my new bra that I really like, that it's cute, and we're swapping things? Or is it someone sending a photo of their bum on Snapchat and being mooned, and then the next friend tries to one-up it by mooning on the bus or something? So, we've got, do they fit in as sexting issues? Young people also don't see words and flirting and texting in that way as sexting, even though when they actually map out what are all the things that you do online that might be classified as sexual or romantic or about relationships, it definitely fits under there. There's a sort of hesitation for young people to use sexting because it feels like an adult thing that taps into all those disciplinary discourses about what we can and can't do with media. It also assumes that it's always about straight young people in heterosexual relationships, as opposed to all the other ways that people may identify or be attracted to people, and how they might use sending sexy images or texts as a way of affirming their identities, because they can't do that out in the street without experiencing homophobia, transphobia too. So when we start to think about sexting, even just asking what is sexting, we've immediately gone, oh, there's all these issues. None of the videos really tap into what that is, the education ones. And our laws in particular don't really fit this kind of amorphous thing of sexy content or images too.
It's a form of control, isn't it? As soon as we give it that term, no one's going to ask their partner, can you please send me a sext this evening, in advance or anything like that. As soon as we do categorise something, it is sort of putting it into a bubble that we can kind of at least feel better about, even if the anxiety is not all that warranted at the time.
one of the difficulties is that people can't often see the other person if they're sending something sexy. And for people who are in established relationships, they might know that their partner is at uni or at school or work or whatever else, or on the tram and is bored. For someone getting a random picture sent to them at some weird time, that might actually make them less likely to hang out with that person because they're in the middle of a lecture, they don't know the person so well, and all of a sudden you have a picture of someone's naked genitals on your phone. And in some ways that's less about the naked genitals and more about how clever we are at communicating with other people, about flirting or getting a sense of what somebody else is doing in their lives. Whereas if you sort of said, oh, what are you doing now? And you started to build up a conversation, you might negotiate wanting that photo. You might also say, that's not for me, and that's okay. And it's actually a way of helping people develop relationships through communication. And then maybe even going to their friend, someone says, hey, well, send me this picture. Do you want that now? And one friend says, oh, definitely. And the other one's like, that's disgusting. And talking about those values and where they come from too. So maybe that's because I'm a teacher. Sexting opens up all these opportunities, which sounds really horrible. But if we're talking about relationships with young people, it's fantastic. And also thinking about ethical relationships. I wouldn't be sitting on a tram and for someone just to have sex with me. So how would I talk to someone in a flirting way or a romantic way or a sexual way without checking in with them to see how they're feeling about it?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's the impressive thing. You do have your mind open to these kinds of issues in this way, because I think teachers have a huge amount of pressure on them, especially with this dominant social discourse of the moral panic, as you say, is probably really pinpointed on teachers as much as anyone.
And particularly because, Monday morning, the drama of what's happened on the weekend in particular comes into your classroom and you've got to get through a whole heap of other things. So trying to negotiate a really open way to talk about things like sexting or sexual social media or even pornography and things like that is quite difficult. And you sort of then need to say, what's the purpose of being in the classroom? I'm not going to take every Monday morning maths class and, okay, we're going to talk about, the issue with sexy media. So helping students to have those conversations in the right spaces in the curriculum is really important too. And also giving young people space to define what those things are and reflect back on their own values and experiences and why they would do stuff in certain ways and not others. Of course though, and I think you brought this up with the eHarmony example, the actual apps and platforms and sites direct us to be either visible in certain ways or use a certain number of images. So even something as simple as the number of spaces on, say, Tinder or Graph that we can upload photos to limits how much of ourselves we can present. If there was only one photo, it's always interesting to ask someone, if you could only choose one photo for your profile, what photo would that be? And is that the same as the first photo of 6 photos on an app? So we have the sites themselves kind of shifting us in a certain way. Even the kinds of ways they encourage you to talk. Oh yeah, let them know how you're going or whatever's happening. So how we are kind of pushed to communicate in certain ways, or the fact that, with any phone now, newer ones, you can take a forward-facing selfie or something, and that gives us more opportunities to do that sort of picture rather than those really awkward old mirror MySpace ones. So those things will shape how we present, what we say and what we do. That are ways that are opportunities, but are definitely limiting in some respects.
Yeah, it's an interesting nexus between the social expectations, which are organic and ever-changing in that sense. I mean, if I was to only have the choice of one photo, it would have to be with my dog, or even just my dog on her own, just because she's so much more popular than me. But, it's understanding the kinds of ways that things do shift over time. And on that note, I suppose the way I probably try and draw all this together and what the way in which you're talking about it really shows is that to understand these things and to acknowledge that there is a subjectivity and that everyone does, as you said, understand what's acceptable for them in different ways.
Yeah, definitely.
That the crucial part of coming to an understanding or some form of understanding is to move past those acceptable and probably necessary moral judgments, which we all have, but to acknowledge that lots and lots of people do use media in various ways, particularly around this kind of issue. And that's only with the incoming, surge of virtual reality, augmented reality, the question of what is sex, what is a relationship, could well, that's only.
And these are questions that have existed all through history. So you can actually map going way, way back to see how that shifted over time. What is gender? Gender didn't exist for so long, and it seems odd because we can talk about it as something that might be about how we feel a sense of self and how we perform in the world and what we wear and where we fit in, and even things that blue is for boys and pink is for girls. It was switched around less than 50 years ago, and something that some young people go, no, pink is for girls, are so deaf, and you go, well, actually these things are changing all the time. What's interesting, instead of moving towards media panics, is to think about power and who has more power to negotiate relationships, whether it be on the street, in a bedroom, a house, or through some sort of Apple platform, and how we can actually support people to have a sense of power in their relationships. So whether it be helping people who are same-sex attracted or gender diverse or something, to be able to have safe spaces so that they don't have to deal with people screenshotting things and telling everybody else something about their lives, or thinking about women and the way that we talk about relationships and what happens if women are visible in talking about sex, and the sorts of things like trolling and that come up too. So in some ways that's a more interesting conversation about power than, oh my gosh, people are talking about sex online, but more who gets to talk about sex in what context and what are the implications of that.
Yeah, that's fantastic. It reminds me, actually, I was at PAX Oz, a huge gaming convention in Melbourne, the last couple of years, and there was one panel which had an incredibly knowledgeable game designer who just said, look, the platforms do with a small shift from the either or, male or female, heterosexual, homosexual, that kind of thing. We can just move to the kind of spectrum status bar that you can choose, and really you actually do enable people to be empowered a lot more. So these kinds of things will happen. I thought about
people will find their own spaces for them anyway. So Tumblr, for example, which was never designed for people to hook up with as such, is a space where people meet and talk, and they may not even have to describe what their gender is, or they may really like to describe their gender in really complex ways, and there is that space to do that, as opposed to, say, early Facebook, where you kind of had a few boxes and that was it, and you had to have this picture and map to a real email address. So having all of the flexibility, and I guess in gaming often there is that flexibility about how you present and what you do and the actions that you can take. It's fantastic for us to rethink what is a relationship too.
Yeah, and in the end it will come down to how we're using the media. As I've said in the past, Cloud Deakin could very well be an online dating platform. Probably not a very successful
maybe not
one.
for
I'm sure
me as a lecturer.
No. But I'm sure there's been, there may have been students who've met through it, and it's just
my favourite example
it.
is taste.com.au, so the recipe site. It was a recipe for zucchini cake, and you scroll down to the bottom of the comments and people were talking, and then it sort of disappeared. They're having this sort of flirty conversation, started off talking about icing down to something else. So often we say, it's the apps that are making everybody, think about relationships and sex, when these conversations happen all the time, whether they be standing in line at the bank or discussing zucchini cake recipes.
Yeah. Wow, fantastic.
So,
there you go. That's a great note to end on. Remember,
check out taste.com.au.
Zucchini cake recipes if you're looking to get into a relationship anytime soon. Thank you very much again for talking to us. That's fantastic. Great. Cheers. Thanks for watching.